Tom showed up on a Tuesday evening, just as Ed was settling into his recliner, the house quiet in that familiar way that came with age. Clara was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes she'd already washed once, more out of habit than necessity. When Ed heard the knock, he knew before opening the door that this wasn't a casual visit. Tom never stopped by without a reason anymore. Tom stood there with a tight smile, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting past Ed into the living room as if measuring the space. He looked thinner than Ed remembered, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with pressure. After a few minutes of small talk, Tom finally sighed and sat forward, elbows on his knees. "Dad, I wouldn't ask if I had another option," he said. "I just need a little help getting through a rough patch." Ed listened without interrupting, hands folded, jaw set. Tom explained the situation quickly, rehearsed almost. A missed opportunity, some unexpected expenses, a loan that could straighten everything out if he could just get approved. The problem, Tom admitted, was his credit. What he needed was Ed's name just as a cosigner. Nothing more. Ed felt that familiar tightening in his chest. He'd heard versions of this before, different words wrapped around the same underlying fear. Still, Tom was his son. Ed had spent decades putting his family first, often without thinking twice. The idea of saying no felt heavier than the risk of saying yes. "It's temporary," Tom said quickly, sensing the hesitation. "I'll handle the payments. You won't even have to think about it." Ed studied his son's face, looking for something certainty, maybe, or shame. He saw neither. What he saw was desperation mixed with confidence, a dangerous combination. He thought about the nights Tom had slept under this roof, the scraped knees, the college tuition he'd somehow managed to pay. This felt like just another sacrifice, smaller than the others. "I'll take care of it," Tom promised. "I swear, this is just to get me back on my feet." That word swear landed harder than Tom realized. Ed nodded slowly. He told himself this was different. This wasn't a handout. It was a lesson in responsibility. Sometimes people needed a lifeline to learn how to swim on their own. When Clara joined them, she listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. Her eyes stayed on Ed more than Tom. "You've helped him before," she said gently later, after Tom stepped outside to take a call. "And every time, it gets a little harder for him to stand on his own." Ed waved it off, though her words lingered. "He's trying," he said. "That's what matters." Clara didn't argue, but the crease between her eyebrows deepened. She'd learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Still, she reached for Ed's hand, squeezing it once, as if to ground him. A few days later, the loan papers arrived in a thick envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Ed opened it alone at the dining table, reading each line slower than necessary. The language was clean, official, stripped of emotion. His name appeared more times than he expected. When Tom came by that evening, he talked through the details with practiced ease, brushing past the fine print. "Standard stuff," he said. "They just need your signature here and here." Ed hesitated, pen hovering above the paper. For a brief moment, he imagined what could go wrong. He imagined calls he didn't want to answer, letters he didn't want to open. Then he imagined Tom's relief, the chance for his son to finally stabilize his life. He signed. The ink looked darker than usual, permanent in a way that made his chest ache. Tom exhaled, smiling wide, clapping Ed on the shoulder like they were partners in something smart and necessary. "I've got this, Dad," Tom said. "Everything's under control." Ed nodded, forcing a smile of his own. But as he watched Tom gather the papers and head for the door, a quiet unease settled in his gut. It was the kind of feeling he'd learned not to ignore over 60 years of life. And yet, as the door closed behind his son, Ed told himself the same thing he always did, that trust was part of being a father, and that this time it would be different. The house felt quieter than before, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Ed couldn't shake the sense that something had already begun to slip out of his hands. Weeks passed, quietly at first, the way problems often do before they announce themselves. Ed tried not to watch too closely, but he noticed things anyway. Tom's car was newer. His phone changed. He talked about dinners out, about plans, about things that didn't sound like a man tightening his belt. When Ed asked how work was going, Tom answered quickly, confidently, as if speed alone could pass for stability. But the strain showed up elsewhere. Ed felt it when he balanced the checkbook and found himself double-checking numbers that had never needed a second look before. He felt it when he hesitated at the grocery store, when a small, unfamiliar caution crept into everyday decisions. He told himself it was temporary. Tom had promised. This was just the awkward middle before things straightened out. Then the letter came. It sat in the mailbox longer than usual, white and unremarkable. The return address stamped with the bank's logo. Ed felt a flicker of unease even before opening it. He stood at the kitchen counter, reading the first line, then the second, his breath growing shallow. Missed payment. Past due balance. Immediate attention required. The words blurred for a moment. Ed read them again, slower this time, hoping he'd misunderstood. He hadn't. Tom hadn't made the payments. Not one. The loan Ed had co-signed trusted with was already sliding toward trouble. That night, Ed called his son. Tom answered casually, as if Ed were calling to chat. When Ed mentioned the letter, there was a pause, just long enough to register. Then Tom laughed lightly. "They send those out all the time," Tom said. "It's automatic. They're aggressive, that's all. I'm sorting it out." Ed gripped the phone tighter. "Sorting it out how?" "Dad, relax," Tom replied. "I've got it under control. You're worrying for nothing." But Ed was already worrying. He could hear it in the gaps between Tom's words, in the way he deflected instead of explained. After the call ended, Ed sat in silence, staring at the wall. The letter folded neatly in front of him, like something he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't throw away. Clara noticed, of course. She always did. "You're not sleeping," she said one morning. "And you've been quiet." Ed told her about the letter. Her face tightened, not with surprise, but with confirmation. "You need to talk to him," she said. "Really talk to him. This isn't just about Tom anymore. This affects us." Ed nodded, though a knot formed in his chest. He'd hoped naively that things wouldn't come to this. Confrontation felt like failure, like admitting he'd been wrong to trust. When Ed finally sat Tom down, it wasn't dramatic. No raised voices at first. Just two men at the same table where homework and family dinners used to happen. Ed laid the letter between them. Tom avoided it. Then, slowly, he sighed. "I meant to catch up," Tom said. "I just needed some breathing room." "Breathing room for what?" Ed asked. Tom looked away. "Life, expenses, things got away from me." The truth came out in pieces. The loan money hadn't gone where Tom said it would. Some of it covered bills, sure, but a lot of it went elsewhere. Upgrades, comforts, a version of life Tom wanted to maintain, even if he couldn't afford it. Ed felt something crack inside him. Not loudly, just enough to change the shape of things. "You promised me," Ed said quietly. Tom shrugged, defensive now. "I didn't think it would matter this fast." That was the moment the anger arrived, sharp and cold. Ed wasn't just disappointed. He felt used. His trust, his name, his future treated like a buffer Tom could lean on without consequence. "You put us at risk," Ed said. "You put your mother and me at risk." Tom bristled. "You're overreacting." But Ed knew he wasn't. He could feel it in his bones. The loan wasn't just Tom's problem anymore. It was his. And unlike past mistakes, this one had Ed's signature stamped across it in ink that wouldn't fade. Later that night, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, Ed sat alone with the letter again. The numbers didn't change no matter how long he stared at them. For the first time, the truth settled in fully. He was in deeper than he'd ever planned, and he had no idea how to get out. The second letter arrived by certified mail. Ed didn't need to open it to know it was worse than the first. The envelope was thicker, heavier, as if the paper inside carried its own weight. When he finally tore it open, his hands trembled despite his effort to stay calm. The language was no longer politely concerned. It was firm, legal, unforgiving. If payment was not made immediately, the bank would pursue further action. Ed sat at the kitchen table long after Clara had gone to bed, the house wrapped in silence. This loan had been meant as a bridge for Tom, a temporary support until things stabilized. Instead, it had become a snare tightening around Ed's own life. Retirement savings, credit, the house he and Clara had built decades in. All of it suddenly felt exposed. The next morning, Ed made an appointment he never imagined needing. Attorney Richard Graves had been recommended by a neighbor, a man known for his directness. His office smelled faintly of old books and coffee that had gone cold. Richard didn't soften the truth. "As a co-signer, you're equally responsible," he said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "If your son defaults, the bank comes after you. They can lien property, garnish accounts. Nothing here protects you just because the debt wasn't yours to begin with." Ed swallowed. "My home?" Richard nodded once. "Yes." The word landed like a blow. Ed left the office with a folder under his arm and a hollow feeling in his chest. The safety he'd spent a lifetime building felt suddenly fragile. When Ed told Tom about the legal notice, Tom barely reacted. "I said I'll handle it," Tom repeated, irritation edging his voice. "You're panicking for no reason." Ed looked at his son and saw what he hadn't wanted to admit before Tom wasn't overwhelmed. He was avoiding. There was a difference, and it mattered. Clara's patience began to crack. "We can't keep covering for him," she said that evening. "Every time we do, he learns nothing." Ed knew she was right. He also knew how hard it was to accept. Protecting Tom had become instinct, but now that instinct was threatening to cost them everything. The argument came days later, raw and unavoidable. Ed raised his voice for the first time in years. "I trusted you," he said. "I put my name on that loan because I believed you." Tom fired back just as sharply. "You don't know what it's like out there anymore. You had your time. Things aren't the same." The words cut deeper than Tom intended, or maybe exactly as deep. Ed felt anger surge, but beneath it was something heavier: grief. For the son he thought he knew, for the bond he believed was solid. "I didn't do this to hurt you," Tom said. "I'm under pressure." "So am I," Ed replied. "Only I didn't choose this." The room felt smaller with every word exchanged. Years of unspoken resentment surfaced, colliding with fear and pride. Clara stood between them at one point, her voice shaking as she begged them both to stop. But the damage had already been done. Later that night, Ed sat alone, staring at the folder from the attorney's office. Legal action, asset protection, words that felt cold and foreign when attached to his own family. Richard's voice echoed in his head. "You need to think about protecting yourself." The idea of taking legal steps against his own son made Ed feel sick, but doing nothing was no longer an option. As the house settled into uneasy quiet, Ed was left with a single, bitter realization. He had trusted the wrong person, and now every possible choice seemed to lead to loss. Ed woke before dawn, the house still dark, his mind already racing. Sleep had become shallow, broken by numbers and what-ifs that refused to stay quiet. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, he had already made the call he'd been avoiding. The bank representative spoke calmly, professionally, as if discussing routine maintenance instead of the possible collapse of a man's future. Ed listened carefully, pen in hand, writing down every option. "There is one way to remove yourself from the loan," she said. "You would need to pay the remaining balance in full. Once it's settled, your name comes off." Ed closed his eyes. "And if I do that?" "It would clear your credit exposure," she replied. "But you would be responsible for the entire amount." The word sat heavy in the air. Paying it off would protect his name, his home, his future, but it would drain savings meant for retirement, for emergencies, for the quiet years he and Clara had planned. It would fix the problem by transferring it entirely onto his shoulders. When Ed hung up, his hands rested on the table longer than necessary. He felt older than he had the day before. Tom, meanwhile, seemed to be unraveling. He avoided calls. When he did show up, he was agitated, pacing, speaking in half-finished thoughts. Instead of acknowledging the mess, he doubled down on expectation. "You can help me one more time," Tom said. "Just until I get through this." The words hit Ed harder than any accusation. One more time. As if there hadn't been dozens already. Each one framed as temporary. Each one leaving a deeper mark. Ed began to see the pattern with painful clarity. Every rescue had taught Tom the same lesson, that someone else would absorb the fallout. That responsibility was optional if Ed was nearby. That night, Ed sat with Clara at the kitchen table. No papers, no raised voices, just truth. "If I pay it off, we're safe," Ed said. "But he learns nothing." Clara reached for his hand. "And if you don't, he might finally have to face it." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's what has to happen. Loving him doesn't mean saving him from every consequence. Ed felt the pull in both directions. The instinct to protect hadn't faded just because logic demanded restraint. It hurt to imagine Tom struggling. It hurt more to imagine losing everything they'd built. The confrontation came the next evening. Ed didn't shout. He didn't soften it either. "I can't fix this for you," he said. "You made this mess. You need to take responsibility for it." Tom stared at him, stunned. "So, you're just going to let it fall apart?" "I'm going to stop pretending it's mine to fix," Ed replied. "If this loan costs us our home, that will be on your choices, not my silence." Tom's face twisted with anger. "You're doing this to punish me." "No," Ed said. "I'm doing this because I won't lie to you anymore." The words hung between them, heavy and final. For a moment, Ed wondered if this was the line that would break them completely. But backing down now would undo everything. Tom stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the walls. Ed remained where he was, heart pounding, hands steady in a way they hadn't been for weeks. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. He knew this decision might cost him his relationship with his son. But for the first time since signing that paper, Ed felt something close to resolve. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't be shielding Tom from it. The court notice arrived on a Friday afternoon, thick and unmistakable, stamped with authority Tom could no longer ignore. This one wasn't from the bank. There was no polite language, no room for interpretation. Late fees had become penalties. Missed payments had turned into formal action. Tom read it twice, then a third time, his hands shaking. For the first time since this began, fear cut through his defenses. Not irritation, not denial, fear. The kind that tightens your chest and makes escape impossible. He drove straight to Ed's house. The paper crumpled in his fist like something poisonous. When Ed opened the door, Tom didn't speak. He handed over the notice and looked away, his jaw clenched as if holding back something that had been building for months. "I didn't think it would get this far," Tom said finally, his voice cracking. "I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." The anger Ed had been carrying didn't disappear, but it shifted. Seeing his son like this, stripped of excuses, triggered something deeper. Not relief, not victory, just the painful clarity of watching consequences arrive exactly on schedule. Tom sat at the kitchen table and broke down. "I was too proud," he admitted. "Every time I fell behind, I told myself I'd catch up. I didn't want to admit I was failing. Now I'm stuck." Ed listened. Really listened. He saw the panic behind Tom's words, the weight of mistakes compounding until escape wasn't possible. But he also saw the pattern, the silence, the avoidance, the assumption that someone else would absorb the impact. "I can help you plan," Ed said carefully, "but I won't save you from this." Together, they laid everything out. Income, expenses, debts. Tom had hidden even from himself. The loan was just the surface. Beneath it was a web of poor decisions and deferred responsibility. The realization settled heavily over the room. Clara joined them quietly, absorbing the truth without interrupting. This wasn't just Tom's crisis, it was a family reckoning. For the first time in years, Ed and Tom talked without posturing. No defensiveness, no blame, just honesty, raw and uncomfortable. "I didn't think you believed in me anymore," Tom said. Ed exhaled slowly. "I believed too much. And that didn't help either of us." The admission surprised them both. Ed saw clearly now that protection had turned into permission. That love without limits had cost them years of trust. "We can't go back," Ed continued. "And we can't move forward unless you carry this yourself." Tom nodded. He didn't argue. The weight of the court notice made resistance pointless. He understood now that this wasn't about money. It was about accountability. "I'll pay it back," Tom said. "All of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to fix what I broke." Ed wanted to believe him. He also knew belief alone wouldn't rebuild what had been damaged. They agreed on a plan, installments, strict budgets, no shortcuts. It wouldn't be easy. It wasn't meant to be. As the night stretched on, the house felt different. Heavier, but clearer. Tom left quietly, not angry this time, but sober with understanding. Ed watched from the window as his son walked to his car, shoulders bowed under the weight of reality. This was the beginning not of resolution, but of accountability. And Ed knew the hardest part wasn't behind them yet. Change didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, measured not in promises, but in small, visible effort. Tom began sending payment confirmations without being asked. They weren't large amounts, and they didn't erase the debt overnight, but they were consistent. For the first time, Ed could track progress without bracing himself for disappointment. The debt still loomed. Bills still existed. The numbers didn't magically shrink, but something fundamental had shifted. Tom was facing them instead of running. Ed made his role clear from the start. He listened. He advised when asked. He did not open his checkbook. "I'll help you think it through," he told Tom one evening. "But the weight has to stay on your shoulders." Tom didn't argue. He nodded, accepting the boundary without resentment. That alone felt like progress. The house began to feel different. Conversations changed. The old tension, sharp, defensive, brittle, gave way to something quieter. Tom stopped asking what Ed thought he should do and started explaining what he planned to do instead. There was a difference, and Ed noticed it every time. Tom cut back where it hurt. Nights out disappeared. The new phone went back in its box. His car became a tool instead of a symbol. He took on extra hours, then a second job when one became available. The work was exhausting, and it showed. Dark circles formed under his eyes. His shoulders slumped with fatigue, but he didn't complain. A few months in, Tom landed a better position. Nothing glamorous, but stable. He came by that night, holding the offer letter like proof that effort still meant something. Ed read it carefully, nodding once. "It's a start," Ed said. Tom smiled, tired but proud. Clara watched all of this with cautious hope. She encouraged Tom, praised the progress, but never assumed it was permanent. She had seen improvement before, only to watch it unravel. Her support was steady, but her eyes stayed watchful. "I just want this to last," she told Ed quietly one night. "So do I," Ed replied. Ed himself wrestled with conflicting emotions. He still remembered the betrayal, the nights of panic, the signature that had nearly cost him everything. Those memories didn't fade just because Tom was trying now. But alongside the frustration, something else began to grow. Pride. It surfaced in unexpected moments when Tom talked about budgets instead of plans, when he mentioned saying no to himself, when he admitted how hard it was without asking Ed to fix it. These weren't grand gestures. They were signs of someone learning restraint. The distance between them began to narrow, not through apologies, but through shared reality. They talked more, not about the past, but about what came next. Work, health, the future. Conversations that had felt impossible months earlier now came naturally, if carefully. Neither of them pretended everything was healed. Trust wasn't a switch you flipped. It was something rebuilt piece by piece, and both men knew how easily it could collapse again. One evening, after reviewing another payment confirmation, Ed leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement. Tom was trying. That didn't erase the damage, but it mattered. As Tom left that night, Ed stood at the door a moment longer than usual, watching his son walk away under the porch light. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and unforgiving. But for the first time since the loan, Ed felt they were walking in the same direction. Ed had always believed that being a good father meant absorbing impact, taking the hit so his children wouldn't have to. It had felt noble when he was younger, necessary even. But sitting alone in the quiet of early morning, he finally admitted what that belief had cost him. By stepping in every time, he hadn't protected Tom. He'd postponed the moment Tom would have to stand on his own. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with regret. Ed thought about the compromises he'd made over the years, the savings he'd drained, the risks he'd taken, the silence he'd chosen when speaking up felt too harsh. He had confused love with rescue, and in doing so, he'd left himself exposed. Setting boundaries felt unnatural, almost selfish, but he was learning that without them, love collapsed under its own weight. Tom noticed the change too. One evening, after making another payment, Tom stayed behind instead of heading straight out the door. He sat across from Ed, hands folded, posture uncertain but sincere. "I didn't understand it before," Tom said. "I thought you were just being hard on me, but you weren't. You were forcing me to wake up." Ed listened, letting the words settle. Gratitude had replaced entitlement, and it showed in the way Tom spoke carefully, deliberately. "If you'd bailed me out again," Tom continued, "I'd still be lying to myself." The admission stung and soothed all at once. Ed nodded, not trusting himself to respond immediately. He had wanted to be seen as supportive, not distant. But maybe this honesty was what support actually looked like. They talked about the future that night, not in broad optimistic strokes, but in realistic terms. The debt would take time. Trust would take longer. There would be setbacks neither of them could predict. But for the first time, they agreed on something essential. The effort was worth it. "I don't expect things to just go back to normal," Tom said. "I just don't want to keep running from what I did." Ed appreciated that. He had no interest in pretending nothing had happened. Healing didn't require erasing the past. It required learning from it. In the weeks that followed, Ed made changes of his own. He met with a financial advisor, reorganized accounts, tightened plans that had grown loose over the years. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He wanted security for himself and Clara, something he realized he'd neglected in his rush to save others. Clara noticed the shift immediately. "You seem lighter," she said one night. "I feel clearer," Ed replied. She smiled at that. Not because everything was fixed, but because something was finally moving in the right direction. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel fragile. Tom kept working, kept paying. The numbers moved slowly, but they moved. Each payment felt less like punishment and more like progress. He didn't celebrate it, he respected it. The family wasn't healed, not completely. There were still moments of tension, silences that carried old memories. But there was also effort, real, sustained effort, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, standing in the driveway, Ed and Tom talked about nothing important. The weather, work, small things. It felt ordinary, and that, somehow, felt like progress. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they also knew they weren't walking it alone anymore. This time, the past wouldn't decide what came next. Ed had said everything except the one thing that mattered most. He'd talked about money, responsibility, plans, and consequences, but he hadn't talked about how it felt. The quiet cost of being the safety net, the exhaustion of being expected to absorb every fall without complaint. One evening, after dinner, he asked Tom to sit with him. No paperwork, no numbers, just two chairs facing each other in the living room where so many unspoken things had settled over the years. "There's something I need to say," Ed began, "and I need you to hear it without trying to fix it." Tom shifted, already guarded. "Okay." Ed took a breath. "Being your backup plan hurt me," Tom frowned. "That's not fair. I never meant—" "I know," Ed interrupted gently. "But intent doesn't erase impact." The words hung there. Ed continued, slower now. He talked about the nights he lay awake, wondering how close he'd come to losing everything. About the fear he never voiced because he didn't want to seem weak. About how every request, no matter how small, carried the weight of expectation that he would step in. No questions asked. Tom listened, arms crossed, pride flaring. "I didn't use you," he said. "You offered," Ed nodded. "I did, and that's on me. But over time, it became assumed. And that changed how I felt in my own home." The defensiveness lingered, but it wavered. Tom looked away, jaw tight. Ed could see the struggle, the need to protect his image clashing with the truth he'd been circling for months. "You never had to say yes," Tom muttered. "I shouldn't have had to say no," Ed replied. That landed. Silence filled the room, thick but necessary. When Tom finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of edge. "I leaned on you because I could," he admitted. "And I didn't stop to think what that cost you." Ed felt the admission settle in his chest, heavy but honest. "I kept telling myself I'd fix it before it mattered," Tom continued. "But it always mattered. I just didn't want to see it." Ed nodded once. "I won't do it anymore." Tom looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I won't be your financial savior," Ed said calmly. "I'll be your father. I'll listen. I'll care. But I won't rescue you from your choices." Tom swallowed. The boundary was clear, immovable. He didn't like it, but he understood it. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no hug, no sudden reconciliation, just a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. Tom agreed reluctantly to carry the responsibility himself, to stop waiting for a net that wouldn't be there. Clara watched from the doorway, saying nothing. She saw the tension, but she also saw the honesty breaking through it. Later that night, Ed sat alone. The house quiet again, but different this time. Lighter. He hadn't solved everything. The debt was still there, the future still uncertain, but the silence was gone. And in its place was something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The first payment didn't arrive with celebration. It came quietly, a confirmation email forwarded late at night with no message attached. The amount was modest, smaller than the balance demanded, smaller than the fear the debt still carried, but it mattered. It was proof of motion. Tom was paying. The strain hadn't lifted. Not really. Bills still stacked up. Expenses still outpaced comfort. But something fundamental had changed in the way Tom carried himself. He spoke less about what might happen and more about what he was actually doing. No shortcuts. No optimism disguised as avoidance. Just effort. Ed noticed it immediately. When they talked now, Tom didn't look for reassurance. He explained his plan, asked direct questions, then followed through. The confidence wasn't loud or performative. It was restrained, built from discipline instead of hope. "I've got another payment scheduled next week," Tom said once, almost casually. Ed nodded. Good. That was all that needed to be said. Marie, quiet through much of the turmoil, finally spoke her thoughts one afternoon while helping Clara in the kitchen. She acknowledged what Ed had done, how difficult it must have been to step back when every instinct said to protect. He needed that line, she said softly. Even if it hurt all of us, there was guilt in her voice. The kind that comes from hindsight, from recognizing how long behavior had been excused out of love. She didn't absolve herself, but she didn't dwell on it either. Growth didn't allow for denial. Later that night, Clara sat beside Ed on the couch, the television on but ignored. "I'm proud of you," she said, "for holding your ground." Ed exhaled slowly. "I'm still afraid," she nodded. "I know. I worry too. What if he stumbles again? What if we're not there the way we used to be?" Ed didn't answer right away. That fear lived in him constantly, but he also knew what had happened when they were always there. "We're still here," he said finally. "Just not the same way." Tom and Ed existed now in a careful middle space. Not healed, not hostile. A truce built on honesty rather than comfort. They spoke more directly, but less often. Each conversation mattered. One afternoon, standing outside after Tom finished fixing something Ed used to handle himself, they shared a quiet moment. "I know I have a lot to prove," Tom said. Ed looked at him. "You don't have to prove it to me. You have to live it." Tom nodded. There was no argument, just understanding. In private moments, Ed wrestled with his own guilt. He wondered if he'd waited too long, if the damage could have been softened earlier. But those thoughts no longer paralyzed him. He knew now that guilt wasn't a solution. It was a lesson. He couldn't bail Tom out anymore, but he could still be present, still listen, still care. And that distinction mattered. As the weeks passed, payments continued. Slowly, steadily. The debt didn't vanish, but it began to feel finite, manageable, if Tom stayed the course. Ed felt relief, but it was cautious, fragile, built on effort rather than trust restored. He knew the road ahead was long. One setback could unravel everything. One lapse could test the boundaries they'd fought to establish. Standing alone one evening, Ed stared out into the darkened street, aware of how much still hung in the balance. This was only the first step, and the hardest part was still ahead. The pressure didn't ease just because Tom was trying. In many ways, it grew heavier. The payments kept coming due, relentless and indifferent to effort. Even with the second job and tighter spending, the numbers barely moved fast enough to feel encouraging. Tom carried the stress with him everywhere, into work, into sleep, into the quiet moments when distraction used to live. It showed in the way his hands shook when he checked his phone, in how easily frustration snapped through his voice. At work, his focus slipped. Deadlines felt heavier. Mistakes that never used to happen crept in, small but noticeable. His supervisor pulled him aside more than once, concern edged with warning. Tom nodded, promised improvement, then stayed late to catch up, running himself thinner each week. Ed saw it in fragments: a tired posture, a shorter temper, long silences where confidence used to sit. He wanted to step in. The instinct hadn't disappeared, it never would. Watching his son struggle without reaching for his wallet felt unnatural, almost cruel. But every time Ed considered offering money, he remembered where that road led. Relief today, collapse tomorrow. So he chose the harder thing. He listened. He asked questions. He didn't fix. Tom felt the weight of that decision keenly. Guilt pressed down on him from every side, not just for the debt, but for the strain he knew he'd placed on his family. Still, he refused to ask for help. Pride, sharpened now by shame, kept his mouth shut even when the bills stacked higher than he could manage. Some nights, he sat alone in his car, hands on the steering wheel, calculating which payment could be delayed without immediate consequence. The answers never felt good. Marie became a quiet bridge between them. She checked in with Tom without judgment, reminded Ed that emotional distance could be as damaging as financial rescue. She understood that growth wasn't linear, and that independence, once delayed, came at a cost. He's carrying it, she told Ed, even when he doesn't say it. Clara struggled more openly. Watching Tom's strain stirred her instincts to protect. She reminded Ed gently at first, then with more urgency that family didn't abandon each other in hard times. What if this breaks him? She asked one night. What if we're pushing too hard? Ed felt the question lodge deep. He asked himself the same thing in quiet moments. Was he being firm or unforgiving? But when he imagined stepping in again, imagined the relief on Tom's face followed by the slow return of dependence, he knew he couldn't do it. Not this time. I won't let him drown, Ed said. But I won't carry him either. The breaking point came when Tom faced losing his car. Without it, work would become nearly impossible. Missed payments had triggered warnings first polite, then urgent. The reality hit hard. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was life narrowing. Tom stood in the driveway one evening, staring at the car like it might disappear if he looked away. He felt the full weight of how far he'd let things go, how thin the margin for error had become. For the first time, he didn't think about calling Ed. He thought about what he could sell, what hours he could add, what pride he could swallow. Ed watched from the window, heart heavy. Every part of him wanted to intervene, to make one phone call and restore balance. Instead, he stayed where he was, trusting that struggle, real struggle, was the only teacher left. Still, doubt crept in. Late at night, Ed replayed every decision, wondering if he'd chosen the right path, if strength had crossed into severity, if love had become too rigid. But beneath the uncertainty, one truth remained clear. If Tom was ever going to stand on his own, this was the moment. And whether it ended in growth or collapse was something neither of them could control anymore. The call came late, after sunset, when the house had already settled into its quiet routine. Ed knew something was wrong the moment he heard Tom's voice flat, stripped of pretense. I've been evicted, Tom said. No explanation, no excuses, just the truth, finally unavoidable. An hour later, Tom stood on the porch with 2 duffel bags and nowhere else to go. His shoulders sagged, not from the weight of the bags, but from the humiliation of how far he'd fallen. This wasn't a setback. It was bottom. Ed felt the frustration surge immediately, sharp and overwhelming. Every warning he'd given, every boundary he'd drawn, all of it had still led here. He wanted to shout, to demand answers he already knew. Instead, he stepped aside and let his son inside. Marie watched quietly as Tom passed through the doorway, her expression torn between relief and worry. This was what family did, but it couldn't become what family always did. Ed didn't waste time pretending this was normal. You can stay, he said that night, voice steady but firm. Temporarily. This is not a reset. It's a pause. Tom nodded, eyes down. I understand. There's a timeline, Ed continued. And expectations. You're not settling in. You're getting back on your feet. The words stung, but they needed to. Clara struggled more openly. Seeing her son under their roof again stirred memories she wasn't ready to revisit. She pulled Ed aside later, her voice low. We can't let this drag on, she said. But we also can't just throw him back out there. Ed agreed. We help him plan, not hide. The next few days were heavy. Tom slept poorly. He moved through the house like a guest, afraid of overstaying his welcome. The loss of his apartment had stripped away the last illusion of independence. Every failure now felt public. One evening, Ed found Tom sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at job listings on his phone without scrolling. This can't happen again, Ed said quietly, taking the seat across from him. I won't survive watching you fall the same way twice. Tom swallowed. I know. And I hate that it took this for me to see it. Ed spoke honestly then, without anger but without softness either. He talked about his fear of enabling, of confusing shelter with solution. of watching Tom confuse safety with stagnation. "I need to know you're fighting for your own future," Ed said. "Not just waiting for the ground to stop shaking." Tom nodded slowly. "I hurt you. I see that now. And I don't expect you to trust me." That admission mattered. Tom began applying for jobs the next morning. The process was slow and demoralizing. Rejections arrived faster than callbacks. Each one chipped away at his confidence. The emotional toll showed short tempers, long silences, exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. Ed watched, conflicted. He didn't hide his disappointment. "You should have planned better," he said once. Not harshly, but honestly. "This didn't happen overnight." Tom accepted it. "I know." But Ed didn't stop there. "You're still my son, and I'm still here. Just not the way I used to be." That balance support without rescue was fragile. Every day tested it. They both understood this wasn't a turning point with clean edges. It was messy, painful. Progress measured in inches, not miles. Late one night, after the house went quiet again, Ed stood in the hallway listening to Tom's restless pacing in the guest room. The sound carried the weight of uncertainty. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was guaranteed. But for the first time in a long while, Tom wasn't running. And that, fragile as it was, felt like something worth holding on to. The conversation didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, across a kitchen table littered with notepads, coffee cups, and the quiet weight of consequences. This time, Ed didn't lead with warnings or lectures. He led with structure. "We're not guessing anymore," he said. "We're building something you can stand on." Tom listened, pen in hand, shoulders tense. This wasn't about comfort, it was about control. Ed laid out the reality as clearly as he could. Income versus debt. Fixed expenses versus choices. No moral framing, just facts. "You need independence," Ed continued. "Not relief. Relief fades. Independence holds." Tom nodded, absorbing it. For once, he didn't argue or deflect. He asked questions. He wrote things down. When Ed suggested a second job, Tom didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," he said. "Whatever hours I can get." They cut ruthlessly. Subscriptions, extras, anything that wasn't essential. Tom flinched at the list, realizing how much of his old life had been built on borrowed stability. Sacrifice wasn't theoretical anymore, it was immediate. Ed made his role clear before they finished. "I'm here to help you think, not to pay," he said. "That part's done." Tom accepted it without resentment. In fact, there was relief in knowing exactly where the line was. Marie watched from the edge of the room, saying little, but her posture softened as the plan took shape. She'd waited a long time to see Tom engage with reality instead of outrunning it. "This feels different," she said quietly. In a good way. The weight of it all began to settle on Tom over the next few days. Early mornings, long shifts, rejection from jobs he applied to, followed by acceptance from ones he never imagined taking. Each decision cost him something: time, comfort, pride, but it also gave him something back: control. Ed worried in silence. Plans looked good on paper. Life had a way of testing resolve. He watched Tom come home exhausted, hands raw, eyes dulled by effort, and still, Tom showed up the next day. This was the moment Ed knew mattered most. Not the promises, not the apologies. This sustained discomfort, the kind that forced change or broke resolve. Tom felt it too. There were moments he wanted to quit, to ask for help, to negotiate a softer landing, but the absence of a safety net sharpened his focus. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting to be saved. One evening, after finishing a late shift, Tom sat alone on the porch, breathing in the night air. He was tired in a way that felt earned. The debt was still there. The future still uncertain. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't being punished. He was being trusted. Ed joined him, neither of them speaking for a while. Finally, Ed broke the silence. "This is your moment," he said. "It can go either way." Tom nodded. "I know, and I won't waste it." The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. As the house settled around them, both men understood the same truth. The plan was only as strong as the choices Tom would make next, and every day would test it. Progress didn't break cleanly from the past. It bent, wavered, then cracked. Ed noticed the signs before Tom said anything. A missed transfer. A delay that hadn't been part of the plan. Then a charge that didn't belong, small, unnecessary, careless. On its own, it meant nothing. Together, it told a familiar story. When Ed asked, Tom hesitated. That hesitation said everything. It was just once, Tom said. I needed it. Ed felt the frustration rise, sharper this time because he'd allowed himself to hope. You didn't need it, he replied. You wanted it, and you knew better. Tom looked away. I'm trying. I know, Ed said. But trying without discipline is how we got here. The confrontation that followed wasn't loud. It was worse than that, tight, controlled, loaded with disappointment. Ed told Tom he couldn't keep offering emotional support if Tom wasn't committed to real change. That watching the same patterns resurface felt like reliving the betrayal all over again. I won't carry this for you, Ed said. Not financially, not emotionally. That was when Tom broke. The composure he'd been forcing for months collapsed into something raw and unguarded. He admitted how heavy the pressure felt, how every responsible choice reminded him of how far he'd fallen, how the fear of failing again sometimes made him reach for comfort instead of progress. I'm scared I'll never get out of this, Tom said, voice shaking. That no matter how hard I try, it won't be enough. Ed heard something new in those words, not excuse, but exhaustion. He realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about identity, about Tom learning to live without escape. Ed stepped back, not away, but inward. He saw his own role more clearly now. This wasn't a problem he could solve with rules alone. Emotional growth didn't follow a ledger. That night, Clara found Ed staring out the window, frustration etched deep into his face. He's going to slip, she said gently. That doesn't mean he's failing. It means he's human. Ed nodded slowly. He wanted certainty. What he had instead was patience, reluctantly learned. Later, he called Linda. He didn't need solutions, just perspective. You're tired, Linda said after listening. And tired people turn disappointment into anger. Don't let that be what teaches him. Her words settled deeper than advice usually did. The next conversation between Ed and Tom felt different, calmer, more honest. They talked not about numbers, but about pressure, about how easy it was to revert when stress piled up, about how change demanded consistency, not perfection. I don't expect you to be flawless, Ed said. I expect you to stay present. Tom nodded. I can do that. They reset the plan, not from scratch, but with room for reality. No shortcuts, no excuses, just steady effort, even when it felt uncomfortable. As Tom went to bed that night, Ed remained at the table, aware of how fragile progress really was. One step forward didn't erase years of habit, but the conversation hadn't ended in anger. That mattered, because if change was going to last, it would be built not on fear, but on persistence. And tomorrow would test that again. The call came early in the morning, just after Tom had finished another restless night. He answered it without hope, expecting another polite rejection. Instead, the voice on the other end offered him a position. Entry level, long hours, modest pay, nothing he would have bragged about once. He accepted immediately. When he told Ed later that day, there was no dramatic announcement, just a quiet statement, as if saying it out loud might make it fragile. I start Monday. Ed nodded, a slow breath leaving his chest. Relief came first, not excitement, not pride, just relief. Movement mattered more than status now. Still, Ed knew better than to confuse a start with a solution. One job wouldn't erase debt or rebuild trust overnight. But it was something. Marie reacted differently. She smiled openly, a softness returning to her face she hadn't worn in months. You stuck with it, she told Tom. That matters. Tom felt that pride settle in carefully. He didn't inflate it. He'd learned what happened when confidence outran discipline. But standing in the mirror before his first shift, wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit, he allowed himself a moment. He was moving forward. The job was harder than he expected. The hours stretched longer than promised. The work itself was repetitive and physical, the kind that left him sore and drained. Supervisors didn't offer patience. Mistakes were corrected quickly and publicly. Tom swallowed his frustration and kept going. There were moments he doubted himself, quiet flashes of insecurity when tasks piled up or instructions came too fast. He reminded himself that starting over wasn't supposed to feel comfortable. Ed watched from a distance. He asked how the job was going but didn't intervene. He offered encouragement without advice, support without solutions. It felt strange to hold back, but he knew this space was necessary. "You earned this," Ed said once. Nothing more. Tom began to take responsibility elsewhere, too. Bills were paid on time, expenses tracked carefully, small decisions made deliberately. The discipline from work spilled into the rest of his life, slowly reshaping habits that had once felt automatic. Some nights, he came home exhausted, questioning whether the effort was worth it. But each paycheck, small as it was, felt different than before. It was clean, earned. Marie noticed the change. The way Tom planned instead of reacted. The way he listened instead of defended. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Ed felt something unfamiliar, a cautious pride that didn't demand control. He wasn't fixing things, he was witnessing them. Still, he stayed aware. New beginnings were fragile. One bad week could undo progress. One wrong choice could reopen old patterns. Tom understood that too. Standing outside after a long shift, he looked up at the night sky and felt the weight of what lay ahead. The road was long, the pay was low, the margin for error was thin. But this job, imperfect as it was, meant possibility. And for the first time in years, Tom wasn't chasing escape. He was building something, slowly, deliberately, and he knew tomorrow would test that resolve again. The notification came in the middle of the afternoon, buried between routine alerts and work reminders. Tom stared at it longer than he expected. The amount was larger than any payment he'd made before, enough to feel the sacrifice, enough to matter. He exhaled slowly. For months, the loan had felt like a shadow following him everywhere, something he tried not to look at directly. This time, he hadn't looked away. He'd faced it, worked for it, and sent the money himself. No assistance, no delay. Pride wasn't loud. It was steady. When he told Ed that evening, he didn't lead with numbers. He simply said, "I made a payment, a real one." Ed nodded, the way he had learned to measured, grounded. "That's good." There was approval in his voice, but not relief. He understood better now than to confuse progress with resolution. Still, the moment carried weight. They sat at the table for a while, the payment confirmation between them. It wasn't a contract. It was proof of effort. "We've come a long way," Tom said quietly. "Not just with this." Ed didn't argue. He thought about the nights filled with anger, the fear he'd swallowed, the trust that had fractured. The distance hadn't vanished, but it had narrowed. "There's still work to do," Ed said. "Trust doesn't come back all at once." "I know," Tom replied. "I'm not asking for it. I'm earning it." Clara joined them, her presence gentle but grounding. She acknowledged the moment without overstating it, the way only someone who'd endured the worst parts could. "This is good," she said. "But don't rush yourselves. Growth isn't a finish line." Tom nodded. He felt gratitude swell not just for the support, but for the restraint. Ed's refusal to rescue him had forced this moment into existence. "I didn't understand it before," Tom admitted. "I thought you were being cold." "But you weren't. You were being honest." Ed absorbed that quietly. He hadn't needed validation, but hearing it eased something he hadn't realized was still tight. "I worried I'd lose you," Ed said. "I still do, but I see you trying." Tom looked down at his hands. "I won't waste it." The conversation drifted from money to life, work schedules, exhaustion, small plans that didn't hinge on escape. Nothing dramatic, just normal. Later that night, Ed stood alone in the living room, the house quiet again. He thought about how long it had been since he'd felt this hope without illusion. The payment hadn't solved everything. The debt remained. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, the direction felt right. Tom had taken ownership, and that changed everything. Ed turned off the light, carrying that cautious optimism with him, aware that tomorrow could challenge it, but willing, at last, to believe in the possibility ahead. Ed didn't announce the change. He simply stopped hovering. No more checking accounts together. No more reminders about due dates. No quiet calculations running in the background of every conversation. Letting go wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate, and it took more effort than holding on ever had. For the first time, Tom handled his finances alone. Ed watched from a distance, resisting the urge to step in, when Tom mentioned bills or tight weeks. He trusted the structure they'd built, even when doubt whispered that one mistake could unravel everything. Trust, he was learning, wasn't a feeling, it was a choice, repeated daily. Tom continued to move forward, though temptation didn't disappear just because he'd improved. There were moments when convenience called louder than discipline. Old habits didn't vanish, they waited. Tom felt them when an unexpected expense hit, when a small indulgence seemed harmless compared to the grind of restraint. This time, he paused. Instead of reacting, he adjusted. He made harder choices. He delayed comfort. The victories were quiet, internal, but they mattered. Marie noticed Ed's struggle before he voiced it. "You've done what you can," she told him one afternoon. "If you stay in the middle of it, you'll pull him back without meaning to." Ed knew she was right. His identity had been wrapped in fixing for so long that stepping back felt like neglect. But this wasn't abandonment, it was trust. Tom's progress was tested soon after. A medical bill, a car repair that couldn't wait, the kind of setbacks that once sent him straight to Ed. This time, he handled it differently. He shuffled plans, picked up extra shifts, and swallowed the frustration without passing it on. Ed found out later, casually, the way parents are meant to after the problem has been faced, not during the panic. That realization filled him with a quiet pride he didn't share aloud. The family dynamic shifted subtly. Conversations lightened. The tension that had once dominated the house loosened its grip. Ed and Tom spoke less about money and more about life, work, health, small, ordinary things. Ed no longer felt like the last line of defense. He felt like a father again. One evening, Marie asked him what he planned to do with his own time now that he wasn't managing someone else's chaos. "I don't know," Ed admitted. "I haven't thought about that in a while. Maybe it's time," she said. Tom's journey wasn't complete. Ed knew that. Growth wasn't a straight line, and independence was fragile. But stepping back didn't feel like surrender anymore. It felt like confidence. Confidence in Tom. Confidence in the hard boundaries he'd held. Confidence that letting go was not the... As Ed turned in for the night, he felt the absence of urgency for the first time in years. Not peace, not yet, but space. And in that space, he allowed himself to believe that whatever came next, Tom was finally strong enough to face it. Tom didn't wake up anxious anymore. The knot that had once lived permanently in his chest had loosened, replaced by something steadier. Not comfort, confidence. The quiet kind that comes from knowing where your money goes, what your limits are, and how to live within them. For the first time in years, his future didn't feel like something chasing him. It felt like something he was walking toward. Ed noticed the difference immediately. It showed in how Tom spoke, how he planned, how he reacted when things didn't go smoothly. There was no panic now, no frantic scrambling for exits. Tom adjusted. He recalculated. He stayed present. This wasn't the son Ed had been arguing with months earlier. This was a man building something slowly, without shortcuts. Marie watched the change with a quiet sense of relief. The tension that had once filled the house thick, unspoken, constant, had eased. Meals felt lighter. Conversations didn't circle the same fears. For the first time in a long while, she believed the worst was behind them. The final payment happened without ceremony. Tom sat alone at his desk, laptop open, hand steady as he confirmed the transfer. He checked the numbers twice, then once more, making sure it was real. When the confirmation appeared, he didn't smile. He just leaned back and closed his eyes. It was done. That loan, the weight that had defined his failures, strained his family, and forced him to confront himself, was gone. Not erased, earned away. When Tom told Ed later that day, he kept it simple. "I paid it off." Ed didn't speak right away. He felt the words settle, sink in, reshape something inside him. Then he nodded, his voice low. "I'm proud of you." The pride wasn't loud or emotional. It was grounded, heavy with meaning. Ed saw clearly now what Tom had done, not just repaid a loan, but reclaimed control. Every hard choice, every uncomfortable boundary, every moment of restraint had led here, and none of it had been handed to him. Trust wasn't magically restored. They both knew that. Scars didn't vanish because a balance hit zero. But the foundation had been rebuilt with honesty instead of hope alone. That evening, Ed and Tom stood outside together as the sun dipped low, the air cooling between them. No speeches, no reflection out loud. "We're not the same people we were," Tom said finally. Ed nodded. That's not a bad thing. They stood there a moment longer, sharing the quiet understanding that growth had changed them both. Ed had learned how to let go without abandoning. Tom had learned how to stand without leaning. The bond between them felt different now. Not fragile, not dependent, stronger for what it had endured. As they went back inside, neither man knew exactly what the future would bring. Life had a way of testing progress when you least expected it. But this time, they were ready to face it together, and on steadier ground than ever before. The first thing Ed noticed was how ordinary it all felt. There were no tense pauses anymore when Tom walked into the room. No calculations running behind Ed's eyes. No silent questions about money, responsibility, or what might go wrong next. They spent time together now, the way people did when nothing was owed, talking about work, fixing small things around the house, sharing coffee, without an agenda. They were no longer father and son bound by debt. They were two men learning who the other had become. Sometimes they worked side by side in the garage, not saying much. Sometimes they sat on the porch in the evenings, the conversation drifting easily. There was no need to fill the silence. It didn't feel heavy anymore. Clara watched it all quietly. She didn't announce her pride or mark the change with words. She saw it in the details, the way Ed laughed more easily, the way Tom carried himself with calm instead of urgency. They had fought hard for this steadiness. She knew how easily it could have gone another way. Tom stayed disciplined. The job that once felt like a burden had become a foundation. He showed up early. He tracked expenses without resentment. He didn't flinch when unexpected costs came up. Each small decision reinforced something deeper, that his life was his to manage. He felt proud in a way he never had before. Not because he'd escaped failure, but because he'd survived it honestly. Ed offered support without hovering. A question here, a comment there. Encouragement without instruction. He remained cautious, not because he didn't believe in Tom, but because experience had taught him that growth needed space as much as care. "I like seeing you like this," Ed said once, simply. Tom nodded. "Me too." The family began celebrating small victories. Nothing dramatic. A meal out after a good month. A quiet acknowledgement of another milestone passed. These moments weren't about relief, they were about recognition. They talked openly now, even when topics were uncomfortable. If Tom felt stressed, he said so. If Ed felt worried, he named it. Neither rushed to fix the other. Listening had become enough. The future was still uncertain. That hadn't changed. Life never stopped testing people just because they'd learned a lesson. But Ed no longer felt braced for impact. He felt prepared. Prepared to trust. Prepared to adapt. Prepared to let his son live his own life. One evening, as they locked up the house together, Tom paused. "I know I don't say it much," he said, "but I know what this cost you." Ed met his eyes. "Just don't waste it." "I won't." Their bond wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was built now on honesty, not obligation. On effort, not assumption. As the lights went out and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, Ed felt something rare and steady take hold. Not relief, not pride alone, confidence. Whatever came next, they would face it without hiding, without leaning on illusions, one step at a time, together. Tom didn't think of his life as fixed. That word felt dishonest. What he felt instead was alignment. His actions finally matched the future he said he wanted. Workdays had purpose now, not just survival, but direction. He set goals that stretched beyond catching up, beyond repairing damage. Career plans, savings milestones, a life not defined by recovery, but by intention. He kept reminders of his past close, not as punishment, but as reference. The mistakes weren't erased, they were studied. Ed watched all of this with a sense of closure he hadn't expected to feel. For a long time, he'd carried the quiet fear that his hardest decision, the refusal to rescue, might cost him his son. Instead, it had given Tom back to himself. Tough love had always sounded harsh to Ed. Now he understood it differently. It wasn't cruelty, it was restraint. And it had worked. Marie noticed the change in Ed as much as she did in Tom. The tension between husband and son had once seeped into everything. Now, that weight had lifted. Ed slept better, laughed more easily. He no longer looked like a man bracing for bad news. They talked more too about the past, without blame. About the fear they'd both carried during the worst moments. About how close they'd come to losing each other without realizing it. "We did the best we could," Marie said one night. Ed nodded, even when it didn't feel like it. Tom began planning for a future that wasn't reactive. He thought about advancement, training, opportunities he once dismissed as unrealistic. He made lists not of debts, but of possibilities. It felt unfamiliar, but steady. He shared those plans cautiously, aware that confidence without humility had failed him before. Ed listened without interrupting, offering thoughts without direction. The difference mattered. Forgiveness arrived quietly, not in declarations, not in apologies repeated until they lost meaning, but in the absence of resentment. In Ed's ability to look at Tom without replaying the past. And, just as importantly, in Ed's ability to forgive himself. He had blamed himself for too long, for trusting, for enabling, for almost losing everything. Letting go of that guilt felt like the final step he hadn't known he needed. The holiday meal came without ceremony. No speeches, no reflections out loud. Just family gathered around a table that had seen too many tense dinners before. This one was calm, uneventful in the best possible way. They talked about small things, laughed at old stories, passed dishes without awkward pauses. Peace didn't announce itself. It settled in. Ed watched Tom across the table, healthy, present, grounded. He looked at Marie beside him. Her expression relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in years. The road ahead wasn't perfect. There would be challenges. There always were. But the direction had changed, and that mattered more than certainty. As the evening wound down and the house grew quiet again, Ed stood for a moment, taking it in. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning built on truth, forgiveness, and the hard-earned understanding that love didn't mean saving someone from their life. It meant trusting them to live it. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The walk began without a destination. Ed and Tom moved side by side down the quiet street, the late afternoon light stretching their shadows ahead of them. Neither spoke at first. There was no need to rush the silence anymore. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt earned. They had walked this route countless times over the years when Tom was younger, when conversations were easier before expectations and disappointments had piled up between them. Today, the road felt different. Not lighter, exactly, just honest. "I didn't think we'd end up here," Tom said eventually. "Not like this," Ed nodded. "Neither did I." They talked about the moments that had nearly broken them. The loan, the anger, the nights neither of them slept. The distance that grew when pride replaced communication. They didn't revisit details to reopen wounds, only to acknowledge how close they'd come to losing everything that mattered. "I was afraid," Tom admitted. "Not just of failing, but of what I'd already done." Ed listened without interrupting. He had learned that forgiveness didn't require explanation. It required presence. After a few steps, Ed spoke quietly. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said, "but it's the only way to heal." Tom let the words settle. He understood now what they cost. The family felt that change too. At home, the tension that once lingered in every room had dissolved. Meals were simple again. Laughter returned without effort. No one pretended the past hadn't happened, but it no longer defined every interaction. There was peace in knowing the road ahead wouldn't be perfect. Life didn't offer guarantees. What it offered instead was resilience, the ability to face what came next without running. Tom stepped forward with a sense of ownership that still surprised him. He didn't wait for permission anymore. He made decisions, carried consequences, adjusted when things went wrong. Self-sufficiency wasn't a title, it was a practice, reinforced daily. Ed watched from a distance now, the way a parent eventually must. He felt something close to closure, not because everything had been resolved, but because he no longer felt responsible for outcomes that weren't his to control. He had done what he could. He had chosen boundaries over fear. He had chosen forgiveness over bitterness. And in doing so, he had given his son the space to become who he needed to be. The family began enjoying simple moments again. Morning coffee, shared errands, quiet evenings that didn't revolve around problem solving. These weren't dramatic victories, but they were real. Ed understood now that legacy wasn't about money or protection. It was about the example left behind when control was finally released. As the walk came to an end, Tom slowed, looking ahead with a calm certainty he hadn't known before. Ed felt it too, that steady understanding that whatever challenges waited beyond this moment, they would be met with honesty instead of denial. They turned back toward home together, not as a man rescuing his son, not as a son hiding from his mistakes, but as two people who had faced the worst of each other and chosen to move forward anyway. Final line. Ed and Tom walk into the future, side by side, their bond stronger than ever, a testament to the power of forgiveness and love.